When looking back on something as old as the ancient Roman Empire, it's easy to simplify and gloss over most details, and focus on the major people and events. People like Julius Caesar, Nero, and Marcus Aurelius, just to name a few of the more famous ancient Roman individuals. Places like the Colosseum, Trajan's Forum, and the Pantheon are considered to be the finest in Roman architecture. But what about the baker down the street, or the servants preparing for the day? What was it really like to be an average Roman at the height of the Roman Empire? During the height of the Roman Empire, there was a 200-year period of relative peace. This period has come to be known as the Pax Romana, meaning the Roman peace. Rome was the largest city in the world, and the hub of the Western world, if not the entire world at the time, with a population estimated at 1 million people by the time of the Pax Romana. Because of this, housing in Rome itself was quite limited. For the wealthy elites, it was the peak of humanity, but underneath the fame and glamour, life for the average Roman was much less enjoyable. The urban area of Rome, as opposed to the surrounding countryside, has been estimated at around 30%, which would not be seen again until London achieved it in around 1800, some 1600 years later. The average Roman in the lower or middle class was called a plebeian, or plebe, which roughly translates to commoner. If you were lucky enough to be born a free man, life would be slightly better for you. In a Roman household, the paterfamilias was generally the eldest man in the family and was the only one who could own land, if they had any. The paterfamilias could consult matters with the materfamilias, but the materfamilias had very little power in her own right. At the time, the paterfamilias held absolute power in the family finances, domestic affairs, and when and to whom his children would marry, and at any point if he was angered, he could disown, sell into slavery, or even kill his children without legal repercussions. Daughters were often married in their early teens or younger to men in their 20s or 30s, and could only gain some sort of independence after having 3 children that lived for more than 3 years. Only then could a woman consider divorce, as before she did not have the legal right. Slavery, as with most of history, was common and a part of the social structure of Rome. Most commonly, slaves were prisoners of war and could come from Asia Minor or Syria, Africa, or the British Isles. Education during the Pax Romana was more informal than modern schooling, and was highly dependent on your social status and wealth. The wealthier the paterfamilias, the more formal and well-rounded the child's education would be. For the poorer Romans who couldn't afford a private tutor, the child would be sent to public schooling, called a ludus litiarius. There was no requirement for where these public schools could be. While there were actual public schools, they could be anywhere, at a person's house, or for the very poorest, out on the street. Roman children were taught math, literature, philosophy, and moral instruction on how to be a model Roman. Girls were generally less educated than men, as schooling was seen not as important as trying to find a suitable husband or taking care of the household. But girls were taught the basics, usually at home by the materfamilias, which was generally the mother, but could be any woman that the paterfamilias wanted. Bathing was typically done communally. Everyone from the poorest slave to even the emperor himself bathed in a communal bathhouse. The bathhouses were called thermae, meaning hot, and is where we get the word thermos. Public baths in ancient Rome allowed both men and women to bathe together, and were generally split into 3 separate areas: the tepidarium, the caldarium, and the frigidarium. The tepidarium, or the warm room, was the main room in which the other 2 rooms were connected, and was like a large sauna. It was more of a social area, to talk about business or gossip. The caldarium, or the hot room, was where the actual bathing would take place. The Romans would apply olive oil to themselves, and use a device known as a stringle to scrape off the excess. The excess would then be saved to be used again, or to be used in women's hair. After the olive oil was applied, Romans would bathe in what were essentially pool-sized hot tubs, and were kept hot by an underfloor heating system using tunnels underneath the bath. Finally, there was the frigidarium, or cold room, and was essentially a cold pool chilled with snow. It is not known if there was a specific order that the Romans used the thermae. Some may have had a strict order, while others may have gone at their own leisure. The area surrounding the Thermae generally had a gymnasium or other areas for physical activity. Most Romans living in Rome lived in insula, which were similar to modern apartments with multiple families living in one residence. These Roman insula were often poorly built of timber, brick, or Roman concrete, and could be as high as 9 stories tall, with the smallest apartments on the uppermost levels and the larger, more expensive ones on the lower floors. They were also prone to collapsing and fire. The main floor of the insula was generally reserved for a business called a taberna, such as a restaurant or tavern, and was the equivalent of a fast food restaurant, as the food was cheap and often pre-made. Although these insula were poorly maintained, most had running water and public bathroom facilities located on the premises, which was quite modern for the time. If you were somewhat wealthier, you could afford what was called a domus. A domus was a single-family home consisting of an atrium, bedrooms, dining room, living room, and, if you were wealthy enough, water and bathroom facilities piped right into the domus. A domus was generally closer to the city's important buildings, like government, spiritual, or entertainment centers, than the cheaper and poorer insula. Most of the average Romans had little free time, as they needed to work as much as possible to live, but on occasion, they would get a day off or have some free time. The most accessible form of entertainment for the average Roman were the free plays and theater, which, for the most part, were paid for by the Roman government to prevent riots and uprisings. The plays could range from comedies to tragedies, and the theaters could sit from a few hundred to several thousand people. If you had a bit of extra money, you could attend a gladiator fight at the Colosseum, go to the Circus Maximus to see a chariot race, or go to the campus, where you could swim, race, box, or partake in archery. Many of the poorest Romans were unskilled day laborers, maintaining roads, working in construction, and often working with slaves, although a day laborer would get paid while a slave did not. The most common coins in the Roman Empire was the as, sestertius, denarius, and the less common arius. Depending on the time period, an unskilled day laborer might only make 1 denarius a day. One of the only ways to move up in the social order of the Roman Empire was to join the military. A regular legionary soldier earned between 225 to 300 denarii a year, but often got bonuses and spoils from the campaigns that they had fought in. Another common job in Rome at the time was a merchant, and, depending on what they sold, could be quite profitable and give the merchant a more middle to upper class lifestyle. Pinpointing the exact conversion from ancient Roman to American currency is difficult, as prices fluctuated even during the Pax Romana. And furthermore, there were no modern financial institutions in ancient Rome, making it even more difficult to make a direct comparison. Religion was very important in the eyes of the average Roman, and there were many rituals and festivals that had to be adhered to. Temples to the vast pantheon of gods that made up the Roman religion were everywhere. Temples like the Pantheon, the Temple of Hercules Victor, the Temple of Venus, the Temple of Hadrian, and the Temple of Jupiter were just some of the religious epicenters of ancient Rome. Rome itself had over 400 temples to various gods and goddesses. I hope that this glimpse into life in the ancient Roman Empire during the Pax Romana has shown that even though we are separated from the Roman Empire by over 2,000 years, sometimes it's more interesting to take a look at the more simple and everyday lives of the millions of people that have lived, and for the most part, have been forgotten as opposed to the epic and world-changing events in history. Because for every Julius Caesar or Marcus Aurelius, there were millions of people that have become lost to the sands of time.